Hi, I'm still getting set up really quick. Sorry. I wanted to take a couple last hits before I turned TikTok on. Oh, fuck off. You gotta watch me as I try and set this shit up. It's never easy for me. I need to get another setup, really. That's what it is. Who is that watching? It doesn't tell me. I always love knowing who's talking to me or who's in here. I think that it works better the other way as well. And I need to flip my camera. Flip camera, mirror video. Let's see if I can get it. To work. I think I got it. Yay. Okay, I think I got it. I'm going to try and share to everyone. I think it's still like really for people, and things are going on for people in different areas. I hope that everybody coming in is having a great, wonderful day or evening, wherever it is and however you're holding it. Are the words correct on the camera on TikTok? And I don't know if I can even see comments, so maybe I should make sure those are, yeah, okay. So I'm hoping that the words are correct on TikTok and not backwards on TikTok. I saw this yesterday. This creator had put out this video, and I really love this because I had actually quoted this wrong in my live on Monday morning. And so I figured that this is a perfect example of the quote, and it tells you where to find it and everything else. And so I thought that would be a great one to bring in. Awesome sauce. I was hoping that I remembered that I mirrored it right. Like I remembered to mirror it this time, but I wasn't sure if in the remembering to mirror it, if it was going to be problematic, I guess, or like it wouldn't work right. Mm. Okay, so I was gonna hold space again, and I wasn't able to make it in the evening this week on Wednesday. I will try and get in on the evening just because I know that there are certain groups of people for whom the evening is the best time of the day, or my evening might even be their morning. And so I will be trying to get in on the evening. Hi, Mia. In the evening again soon. But my body has not been in a good space this week. And so by nighttime, my body is kind of giving out right now. Um, but I will try and get back in, and I do want to go ahead and hold space again. Um, and I brought this picture in because of the perfect demonstration of the quote, which is more accurate than my attempt to verbally say it out loud in here the other night. And so I thought that was a good one. I also have the other background, which I'll probably pop up. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys all had this, and so that you guys can see what is actually being stated in 1493 about the Taino people, about Turtle Island Indigenous people. Um, this is becoming something kind of problematic, I feel, and it's being mixed and having ancestry in both spaces. For me, it's becoming sad, right? Um, and so I feel that, you know, all of our ancestors were very big on engendering kindness and community. This idea of othering and this idea of taking from others and exploiting others is a Western thought process that has caused injury to all of us. this Western thought process that has caused injury to all of us. Um, it's not easy to it's not easy to break out of it. And I get that. I get that, right? Um, colonizing thought process, national, colonizing thought process. Um, and, you know, this colonizing thought process that states that you can tell people who their ancestry is and what their ancestry did when their ancestors are still there and still breathing, or that allows one's own disconnect to harm other people instead of maybe joining and learning, right? No, no more than any other group of people ate each other. Cannibalism is actually seen pretty far back in hominins. And cannibalism happens in all cases when desperation happens. There are very few, or as a religious rite. There are very few species that do cannibalization as preferred method of ingestion. Very few. I'm not saying that there are none, but very few that do cannibalism as a method of preferred ingestion of nutrient. For the vast majority of spaces where cannibalism is had on a regular basis, it is ritualistic, as in when your grandparents or your parents or your ancestors or your anybody dies, then you eat their body so that you can continue them in you, right? This idea that there is something that remains in the flesh, and instead of having the flesh waste away, to instead ingest it so that it carries on with you, and in that sometimes carrying on attributes of ancestors, right? And then we also see cannibalism happen in some spaces that is because, like the Donner Party, right? Like, which, by the way, real white, isn't it, right? Uh, the Donner Party, where it is a starving group of people, right? And they don't kill people to eat them; they eat the people that have died, right? So, like with the Donner Party, we're also horrified by this. But what happened is in this large group of people, they got trapped in a middle of a winter. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Okay, I've followed the pathways and the trails and stuff like that. In the middle of the winter, we get like 10 feet, 12 feet of snow in the mountains, right? It's extremely deep. And these are the mountains that I grew up in. And we would get this in like October, and you would get snowed in. So I spent my winters as a child from the time of 5 to the time of about 8. I spent my winters snowed in and on the side of a mountain in the Pacific Northwest, the edge of the range. So it wasn't as bad. Um, but because of this, you get so snowed in, you can't get out, you can't get access, right? And in this, the Donner Party got trapped and had no access to any food, and no hunting access. When their people started dying of starvation or wounds, their people in their death were frozen because of being trapped in like 10 foot of snow and they couldn't get out. And to not die, they ate their dead, right? And it is said that it scarred them for the rest of their lives, right? It was a horrific thing for them, and we have demonized that, but that was survival, and human survival is like that's our innate, right? So absolutely, no more here than any other space on Earth, right? We see it in Neanderthals, even. We see it pretty far back. Evidence of the eating of dead, right? This again does not mean violent act towards another individual. What it means in some cases, or can mean, and we do not have all the facts, and so we cannot say, there are several different things it can mean, right? And so it can mean a ritualistic thing, a belief that there is spirit in flesh. And by imbibing the flesh, you are carrying on the spirit and you are maintaining that person's energy and that person's strengths, right? So that if your grandmother was an extremely powerful healer, then eating of her heart or eating of her different parts of her body might give you this power to heal like her. Like this might be something that you can, maybe she's already been teaching you, and eating of her heart gives you her energy and her knowledge and her wisdom, right? And that's the belief system. And I have to say, I mean, whether it's right or not, it's not for you or I to judge. It's not for you or I to judge what somebody else's belief system is. We all have ideas and belief systems. Some of us don't actually have a belief in something bigger or larger, right? Some of us have a belief that the bigger and larger is the community or the biome, right? Some of us have the belief that the bigger and larger is just energy. Some of us have the belief that even that energy isn't the bigger and larger, right? Some of us believe that something created us, an omnipotent deity. Some of us believe that we were created, and some of us believe that we evolved. But it is not my right to tell you how to believe, and it's not your right to tell me how to believe, right? So if these early people are doing this because this is what they believe, it's not your or my right to state that. And again, I am responding to a comment that Turtle Island Indigenous people had cannibalism and slaves and warfare. No more than any other group of ancient people. All groups of people across the globe have evidence of these things. And there is a difference between slavery, which was basically a form of indentured servitude, and chattel slavery, which turns a human being into a chattel, a cattle. Chattel literally means farm animal. Okay. So basically, the difference between slavery, pre-chattel slavery, and chattel slavery is that slavery does not dehumanize. Slavery does not say you're no longer a human and you no longer have rights. Slavery states you have a period of time that you have to work off. Nothing is monolithic. There are evidences of different types of slavery, yes, but very, very, very rarely is it an inherited state, right? So there's a huge difference between slavery and chattel slavery. The 13th Amendment is slavery. It is pre-chattel slavery, slavery. It is indentured servitude, slavery, because it puts you in a state of enslavement to the government if you break a law. And literally states that no person shall be held in bondage or in a state of lack of freedom unless they break a law and are put into the imprisonment system. Okay. So we have slavery today. But there's a difference between slavery and chattel slavery. And y'all got to fucking stop playing on anything else. You have to. There is a difference. One does not treat the group of people as no longer being human, and the other one does. Period. Okay. So again, yes, all of these things are global. It doesn't matter what part of the globe you are from, your ancestors did these things. Doesn't matter. We all participated in violent activity, right? We all participated in capture play, games, right? Games of war. There is a difference as well between groups that treat life, human life, as being absent in certain groups of humans. Okay. So if you, as a society, are able to dehumanize a specific group of people and make them less than human or chattel, okay, then, Brand, stop that. Then you are able to create the environment we are in. And this is what Western thought has always done. This is what Western thought has always done. It creates a group of others. Okay. It creates a need of others for people to maintain control. That aside is not the point of today's conversation. The point of today's conversation is pre-colonized Turtle Island Indigenous groups. Okay. Again, I was planning on holding space again on Wednesday night so that I can do a nighttime of this, and I will eventually do a nighttime of this. I've had a very hard physical week. I'm disabled, and it makes it very difficult for me some days and some weeks. So because of that, I haven't got to it yet, but I will do that. Maybe I'll do it this weekend. I'm kind of downtime and at home, and we'll see. So with that, uh, I'm not going to keep the comments off completely. I just can't deal with some of the troll and the hate. But I want to maintain open space for people who are Indigenous to Turtle Island, people who are Afro-Indigenous, and people who want to talk about the Hotep Wabu thought process with a quest for understanding and knowledge. Okay. I'm not going to argue and I'm not going to debate. That's not this space. But what we need to discuss is not only the difference in thought process, and not only the rich and deep history, but how erasure affects us all. Now, if you do not know me and you're coming across and you're seeing some fucking white woman talking about Turtle Island Indigenous history and Black history, and you're like, what the fuck? Which, don't blame me. I'm not white. I look it. I know I'm light of skin. I'm white assumed. Any number of way you can put it on it. I'm pretty literally mixed, and I am like everywhere, like all of it globally. I have a Sudanese grandmother who escaped slavery in 1750, pregnant with her master's child, who I've always been able to trace that line to. I have Turtle Island Indigenous grandmothers and was raised within Turtle Island Indigenous communities. And I am also an archaeologist and an anthropologist. And so this is, and have done healing and medicine all my life and have degrees within Western thought process, but worked in these thought processes with an Indigenous thought process first. Widda is a Celtic Indigenous scientist. It's a term that I use for my Celtic Indigenous heritage, which I also have. And because it's a beautiful term, it's the feminine half of the Druids, and it's the pursuit of knowledge of the feminine. And so with that, this is not my typical space and what I speak on. This is not really my lane. But I was asked to speak on this by an Afro-Indigenous human being who is dealing with the backlash and the hate that comes from being an Afro-Indigenous human being when the two different sides of your communities, the two different sides of you seem to be at war over something stupid, right? Over something not stupid, but over the wrong thing to be at war about. Over the wrong thing to be at war about, right? And so that is why we're holding this space and having this conversation. Hello, Odin. So once again, I'm going to open this up with a story that is as old as the people on Turtle Island, because it comes from one of the groups on Turtle Island. When we talk about, thank you, Free Spirit. Thank you. I appreciate that. When we talk about when we talk about history and what we know, I know Turtle Island Indigenous history because was blessed because in the Pacific Northwest, um, being one of the last places to be colonized and being a space that is pretty much it's a rainforest in the Pacific Northwest, and if you get up, I mean, it's all in deciduous rainforest, and it's all like very fertile, and you can escape for days. Like if you can go into the middle of these woods, you can disappear, especially if this is your homeland, right? Especially if this is where you have been forever, right? And so when Indigenous Turtle Island people talk about Indigenous Turtle Island heritage, they are not getting their knowledge because some white person wrote it down. They're not getting their knowledge because somebody documented it. They're getting their knowledge because grandmother told them, because their creation stories were told to them by their grandmother, because their land was taught to them by their grandmother. Because when you are indigenous to a space, and we are all indigenous to a space, right? When you are indigenous to a space, that indigeneity to that space gives you a connection with the biome that somebody from outside cannot see or understand on any level. Okay. And it does not mean that another person who has indigenous practices can't come in and see and learn and understand. But what it means is that if your space has a plant that's indigenous to it that is good for healing stomach nausea, like good for stomach issues, right? And another space has a plant that is good for healing stomach issues. When you are transplanted from one space, transplanted is really the word for this, transplanted from one space into a new biome, you have to now find and identify the plant that is good for stomach, right? And as an indigenous person, you would go, well, I'm not going to just experiment because I'm not stupid. I'm going to ask the people who are indigenous to this area because I've been transplanted into this area. I'm going to listen to the people who are indigenous to this area because I've been transplanted into this area. And I understand as a being of the biome, as a part, as a plant, as an animal, as one of the many that I need to understand my biome and I need to understand my environment, right? So our stories here are as old as time. Our stories here are as old as stories anywhere else. We have a world tree. Every space on this planet has a world tree. Okay. Our stories here are ancient and they run deep. When you come to somebody and tell them that the white people documented this and they kept it a secret, and if we would just go and Google it and find the secrets, why would we Google what grandma said? They didn't write down what grandma said. She didn't give it to them. They didn't ask. They were not appropriate, right? They didn't ask, they took, right? When they were given, they took, right? So we're going to start with the understanding that this story, and if you look at our continent, this story is as old as us, okay? I'm going to tell you who we're talking on now. Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. This is, of all books to recommend, this is the book that I recommend. And I need to actually put it on the site. This is the book that I recommend. I thought about that the other day. But I also recommend finding it in your local library because I know that she does it through the libraries, and she does a vocal, like you can do an audible through her local library, right? And she's an epic being. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for outstanding nature writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals.
She lives in Fabius, North Dakota, where she is a SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. I'm going to read Sky Woman Falling. And then I want you to take a look at a map and take a look at a global, a view of this land. In the winter, when the green earth lies resting beneath a blanket of snow, this is the time for storytelling. Storytellers begin by calling upon those who come before, who pass the stories down to us, for we are only messengers. We've talked about oral history in here before and how oral history is passed down as a word for word and repeated so often that you memorize it as a word for word, right? So it's not something that is as changeable as written history is. In the beginning, there was the sky world. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze, adapted from oral tradition and Shenandoah and George, 1988. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled towards them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she'd ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward, and so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather, loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gratefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon, but the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and before long, a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life in the aid of this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animal, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made, not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all the animal's gifts, coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know of today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clutched in her hand. When she toppled from the hole in the sky world, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too have plenty to eat, many came to live with her on her Turtle Island. Many came to live with her on Turtle Island. Sorry, my words, or my eyes sometimes displace. Our stories say that of all the plants, wingash, or sweetgrass, was the very first to grow on the earth, its fragrance a sweet memory of Sky Woman's hand. Accordingly, it is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people. Breathe in its scent, and you start to remember things you didn't know you'd forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are the way we remember to remember. And so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant, cherished by many indigenous nations. It is also used to make beautiful baskets. Both medicine and a relative, its value is both material and spiritual. There is such a tenderness in braiding the hair of someone you love. Kindness and something more flow between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. Wingash waves and strands, long and shining like a woman's freshly washed hair. And so we say it is the flowing hair of Mother Earth. When we braid sweetgrass, we are braiding the hair of Mother Earth, showing her our loving attention, our care for her beauty and well-being, in gratitude for all she has given us. Children hearing the Sky Woman's story from birth know it in their bones, the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our history, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but also of how we can go forward. I have Bruce King's portrait of Sky Woman, Moment in Flight, hanging in my lab, floating to earth with her handful of seeds and flowers. She looks down on my microscope and data loggers. It might seem an odd juxtaposition, but to me she belongs there. As a writer, a scientist, and a carrier of Sky Woman's story, I sit at the feet of my elder teachers listening for their songs. Hello, lovely ones. On Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 9:35 a.m., I am usually in a lecture hall at the university, expounding about botany and ecology, trying, in short, to explain to my students how Sky Woman's gardens, known by some as global ecosystems, function. One otherwise unremarkable morning, I gave the students in my general ecology class a survey. Among other things, they were asked to rate their understanding of the negative interactions between humans and the environment. Nearly every one of the 200 students said confidently that humans and nature are a bad mix. These were third-year students who had selected a career in environmental protection, so the response was, in a way, not very surprising. They were well schooled in the mechanics of climate change, toxins in the land and water, and the crisis of habit loss. Later in the survey, they were asked to rate their knowledge of positive interactions between people and land. The median response was none. I was stunned. How is it possible that in 20 years of education, they cannot think of any beneficial relationship between people and the environment? Perhaps the negative examples they see every day, brown fields, factory farms, suburban sprawl, truncated their ability to see some good between humans and the earth. As the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope of their vision. When we talked about this after class, I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move towards ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like? If we can't imagine the generosity of geese? These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman. On one side of the world were people whose relationship with the living world was shaped by Sky Woman, who created a garden for the well-being of all. On the other side was another woman with a garden and a tree, but for tasting its fruit, she was banished from the garden and the gates clanged shut behind her. That mother of men made to wander in the wilderness and earn her bread by the sweat of her brow, not by filling her mouth with the sweet, juicy fruits that bend the branches low. In order to eat, she was instructed to subdue the wilderness into which she was cast. Same species, same earth, different stories. Like creation stories everywhere, cosmologies are a source of identity and orientation to the world. They tell us who we are. We are inevitably shaped by them, no matter how distant they may be from our consciousness. And this is something that I want you to note. One story leads to the generous embrace of the living world, the other to banishment. One woman is our ancestral gardener, a co-creator of the good green world that would be the home of her descendants. The other was an exile, just passing through an alien world on a rough road to her real home in heaven. When they met, the offspring of Sky Woman and the children of Eve, and the land, and then they met. And the land around us bears the scars of that meeting, the echoes of our stories. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I can only imagine the conversation between Eve and Sky Woman. Sister, you got the short end of the stick. Thank you. This story has been told since before Europeans got here. This story was documented by people whose elders told it to them. This understanding, this knowledge, and again, I'm going to tell you, this is Braiding Sweetgrass. This is a book that you can go and buy anywhere. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she is SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and Environment. This is somebody who can trace their ancestry back 30,000 years in this land. This is somebody who knows their creation story. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. The Pacific Northwest wasn't really colonized until the 1800s. And even then, because of our deciduous rainforest up here and the fact that it is completely like in dense forest that you can't live in unless you know it, there are places that there are people that, were able to escape. Residential schools were able to escape, different forms of colonization in small pockets and live indigenously and keep their stories for a long period of time. If you are getting your stories for creation stories in this land from white people, even if you think that it's something white people are trying to hide, it's still from white people. Still from white people. If you can't get those stories from your grandmothers, but I can get those stories from my grandmothers. I could not get those stories from one line of grandmothers, but I could get those stories from the other line of grandmothers. And if that's the case, that in and of itself should settle the argument. We're not looking at white people's words. We don't give a flying fuck, other than what Columbus said about the people he met when he got here. This is what he describes. We're not white supremacists in this space. And if you want to use white supremacist talking points and white supremacist thought process to erase a people instead of unite with and work with the people to get rid of the fucking white supremacist thought process, that's your bad, man, not mine. What the fuck? All my grandmothers would have problems with that. The ones who came over on the Middle Passage and the ones who were already here. All my grandmothers would have a hard time with that thought process. My rapist grandfathers, maybe not so much. They might think that, pretty colonizer right there, mighty white. If you are using white supremacist talking points to erase a group of people instead of working together with a group of people, You want land here? The best way for you to get land here is unite with us, because ain't nobody I know want to kick people out. Y'all think you're going to go to court and fight for land back. You think that a guy told a mutual, or somebody that not a mutual, I don't think it's like, it's not like Facebook. Some guy told a friend that he was did a TikTok about he was going to court on it, right? He's going to court to get his land back. He's Hotep. I mean, like he's not Trill Island indigenous, and he's going to court. He's taking the U.S. court to court, or the U.S. to court, to get his land back, right? And all I can think of is, I'm going to be there in that courtroom because I want to watch. If you succeed, I want to know how. But we got better documentation. How you think that we got all this documentation? We've been trying for decades. They even have paperwork where they wrote shit down that they lied, and we can't use that to get our land back. So how you think that your conspiracy theory stuff going to work in court just blows my fucking mind, right? Land back, period. Well, and I think that we need to stop. So many people are looking at this as a talking point. I was invited in by another extremely mixed individual who had. There is a group that's running for presidency that wants to. It's a marginalized group of people, and which is a really cool thing. But they wanted to know what they needed to do to present better for Indigenous people, and invited somebody in to do so, and talk to them about wanting them to be the VP because they're Indigenous, and then did not listen to them. And or they were trying to give information and they were ignored, and so they came to me and some other people and was like, would you come with me so that you can help them understand what I can't get them to understand because they're not hearing me. And so we went there, and then they were like, yeah, we're not gonna, that's not what this meeting was for. This meeting was for, we could apologize for missing a meeting. And it's like, what the fuck, you think you need a whole meeting to apologize for missing a meeting? What the fuck? Anyways, so I was like, it, I spoke and I said, okay, so when can we arrange this meeting? Like, what can we do? And the person was like, well, you can go to my website and fill out a thing, and uh, we can set a time. Let me know what you want to do and what you want to talk about, and we can set a time. And I was like, you need to understand that that is not, they want land back, as like they have land back in their environmental package, right? Like in their thought process for ecology, they have land back buzzwords all over. And it's like, you're telling people that you're going to use their shit and their needs without going to them and asking them what that entails, right? Like, you want to say land back, but have you asked an Indigenous person what land back actually entails? Because literally the ecological package states returning care and governance of Indigenous land to Indigenous people in their Indigenous lands. The wording still provides for cities and states. So what it does is it's basically making reservations sovereign nations. They're supposed to be sovereign nations, motherfucker. What are you thinking you're actually giving? Like, what are you doing as you're saying land back, right? Absolutely. I mean, I think that there are several things that we should do to try and take back that thought process. But we definitely need to look at, like, I think that, I don't know. So first of all, I think that I don't have any desire to have any say on what any of it means. Like, I think that, so I told the person who came to me, I said, what you need to do is you need to have it set in place that you have representatives from every nation ready to go day one. And then you let them decide what land back means. Because land back might mean we have a Council of United Nations and no longer have United States. You have to let people, nations gather and decide what land back truly means, because you can't use it as a buzzword and then decide you're going to give them control of the reservation. They already have control of the reservation, right? Like, nominally, not like it ever actually plays out right, but like all you're doing is giving them what was promised, right? You're not actually actively working towards what is needed, right? But I mean, I personally think what we need to do is take back many of the words. We need to I mean, and I think we're all working very hard. We need to continue to just stomp the idea that Turtle Island Indigenous people are not Turtle Island Indigenous people. And we need to foster an understanding between Black Americans, who are people, that's a culture in and of itself, an ethnicity in and of itself within Turtle Islands, people who live within the diaspora here, and Turtle Island Indigenous people. We have a lot of, there's a lot of lateral shit, and there always has been, right? I have a uh, one of my sisters is, her uncle is, half Haida and half Black. And he says that, like being Black within the Haida community, because many people within communities within the Pacific Northwest are relatively light. Not all communities, but there are specific communities that are relatively light. And Haida happened to be one of them. And so he's rather dark skinned for the Haida community. And that becomes problematic, right? That being Black within that becomes problematic. And that's where we get the problematic for Afro Indigenous people, right? Is because there's that back and forth. And that back and forth, right? And with that back and forth lateral violence that's happening, we have to kind of, there's this idea among both communities, it seems to me from what I have seen, that, excuse me, um, that one community is somehow getting a better shake, right? That one community is somehow getting a better end of the deal. And this idea is something that's been placed within us, right, by society. It's that othering, it's that need to maintain us underneath a control, right? This idea that Black Americans are getting in a better shape than, or better shape than Indigenous Turtle Islanders, right? When all we have to do is look to know. George Chauvin, or whatever his name was. Sorry, not George Chauvin. George Floyd's killer, Derek Chauvin. Chauvin is all I can remember, that motherfucker, right? Chauvin killed 3 people before Floyd, and 2 of them were Indigenous. One was Latin, and one was oh, North Dakota. I can't remember if he was Lakota, or if he was of another nation up in there, right? So like he killed 3 people before George Floyd, 1 Black man and 2 Indigenous people, right? 2 Indigenous men. Um, we don't think of that. We don't see that. Let's not talk about, this was a serial killer who was specifically targeting Black and Indigenous men. He didn't fucking make a distinction. It was whatever space he was in, right? It was whatever space he was allowed to be a racist in. He wasn't making a distinction. Why should we be allowing us to be divided by distinctions somebody else has created within us or between us, instead of understanding that we're supposed to be moving this forward? That the only way to get rid of the fucking white supremacy within the culture, the only way to get rid of the Western thought that's so exploitative within the culture, is to move it forward. And everybody has this fear that land back means get the fuck out. And I have not heard a single person state that. Not a single person. Not a single person. And let's be real. The reason that Turtle Islanders were conquered, genocided, which does not mean that they were completely genocided, but attempt to be all of this stuff happened. The reason all of this stuff happened was Turtle Island indigenous people welcome people in. They say, "Hey, how food? Hey, we got a good soft space to sleep. Let's build you a lodge. What can we do to make you a part of our community? We have some guidelines. We expect you to be a kind and good, decent human being. We expect you to treat life, all life, from plant life all the way up with honor and dignity and respect, right? But the reason that it was so easy to be evil and nasty and betray, and it's documented as the reason, is the documented as naivety, the ability to see a positive and a good in every being, the ability to see humanity and a good in every human being, which Europeans had lost by this time because of their stratification, because of their othering, right? And so when we see this, we absolutely have to understand. No, and don't get me wrong. Again, I don't want to speak for anybody. I am sure that there are people out there who are like, you can all go home. And I know that there have been plenty of times when I have wanted to tell many European people, why don't you go back where you came from? Or, things like that. But I have to say that when I have expressed that desire, in indigenous communities, most indigenous people are like, you can't do that. That's fucked up, right? Like, you know, so most indigenous people that have expressed what land back means do not express land back as get out. They express land back as, and I don't want to go into that any further. I just want to state that that's not what it is, right? I bet Contra. I bet. Well, and that's, a whole other thing, because what we're looking at is there are so many groups of people who are so mixed, because that is resilience. That is like we were talking about the other day. Um, we see so many groups of people who are so mixed because of what happened with the genocide, in the first couple of years within Columbus's voyages, right? Because Columbus's voyages lasted for uh, about 10 years. I think he came over, but the first 2 years he eradicated the Taino people. And when we were talking about it, and I was talking about it within here, what we're looking at is the level of, no one knows the exact number of indigenous people supported by the biome of Turtle Island in 1492 when Columbus landed on the Taino people. A good midway estimate is 80 million, as the numbers range between 50 and 100 million. The Taino people are believed to be upwards of 10 million, though the conservative estimates say 2 million. In 2 years, a man who was exiled from his home for being a drunken rapist, sponsored by the married couple whose god torture kink gave us the Spanish Inquisition, took the Taino people from at the very least 2 million to what we consider to being genetically extinct. This means that their population fell below the level of being able to sustain enough genetic diversity without admixture to prevent inbreeding. This is below 500 at the conservative numbers. The Taino people's knowledge of their biome, along with admixture from other indigenous peoples, Africans, and Europeans, is how they survived as a peoples. This is resilience. Columbus landed in 1492, documented returning to Spain with a cargo of vast riches that included 9-year-old girls to serve as slaves for the very large pedophilic population of the Spanish ruling class, and returned to Turtle Island in 1493 to finish the functional genocide of the Taino people, whose resilience to that genocide is why they're still alive today, still here. And I'm only censoring myself because TikTok can be so problematic. In that time, he laid waste deliberately. Oh, wait. Between the two trips, with a voyage from Spain to Cuba being 10 weeks, Columbus was in the Turtle Islands less than 18 months for the first 2 years of the European invasion. In that time, he laid waste, deliberately and with calculation, slaughtering everyone in a group of at minimum 2 million people. The only discrimination was in the torture applied to the weakest to make the strongest give up their riches. Columbus documented snatching babies from their mother's arms to throw to his war dogs. When the slaughter was done, he moved on to the next indigenous peoples, leaving the few who lived forever changed in his wake. That is an average of 3,100 people a day. 3,100 people a day. And when I talk to people who are from spaces within like Puerto Rico or Cuba or spaces like that, they identify everybody as being Puerto Rican or Cuban, right? There is no idea that you're white or black or indigenous. The division that we have here in the United States is so huge, right? The United States has created these specific groups where one group hates the other group. United States of all countries is literally founded on racist ideology and the attempt to maintain or stratify society through racist ideology. Afro-Indigenous means that you are both African Indigenous, like Indigenous to Africa, and Turtle Island Indigenous, that you have heritage from both continents. Uh, Many people actually have Indigenous and African heritage, right? Just because of the way that colonization has worked. I have a lot of friends actually within the Black community that have Indigenous ancestry as well, that they're kind of raised within the Black community and don't tend to think of themselves more Black than Indigenous. Well, and one thing that somebody pointed out in a wonderful TikTok that I reposted the other day, African heritage is so glorious and beautiful. It is the oldest of us. It is the first of our spaces. It goes back 300,000 years. It is where almost every first happened for us, right? Even like our first fire, our first clothing, like all of Africa, like, and not Homo sapiens for fire and clothing, that would be Erectus, but Erectus in Africa, right? Africa is the cradle of civilization. It is the heart of us. It is the womb of us, right? It is our womb, right? And it is our womb lands, deep, deep, deep in those womb lands. But Africa is our womb, right? And because Africa is our womb, that heritage goes back so deep and so thick. And and having it removed, having it, disconnected is painful. It is horrendous, and I can understand um through my own sense of that disconnect, but also through this, and having to find where my ancestor came from, right? And having to use family DNA to find that, right? Because that's the only way you can really find that, right? Through African DNA here in Turtle Islands. And listening to people talk about how they wish that they could, but they can't afford the DNA stuff to even really find where their ancestry goes to, right? So hearing these things, I absolutely understand. I feel that I can understand and empathize on a level of having some very similar feelings and hearing them frequently. I don't want to tell somebody that I know everything about them or understand them fully and completely, because I do not feel that that's appropriate. But I feel that I can understand on a very good level that it feels very disconnected and it feels very painful to not have that connection to the ancestors that you want to have, especially if you are seeking a reconnection, if you're seeking ancestral worship, right? If that is something that means something to you, right? To kind of throw off this Western thought to get back to that animistic tradition, right? So I can absolutely see that. Um, Africa has such a rich tradition, right? And so many different rich traditions. And I know that it's hard to find all of them between Africa, Europe, anywhere else if you're in a diaspora. We've talked about that with Europe before. How do you find out where your indigenous ancestors are in Europe? And I would state that for the most part, the best way that you can do that is to look to the stories that seem more global within Africa or more uh, diffuse within Africa, the creation stories. Look towards the activities that seem more diffuse, right? Um, and look towards different traditions that uh, feel connected to you because often epigenetics, right, will give you that connection anyways. I think that you can find haplogroups pretty helpful for this. I know, like with haplogroups within Europe, you can use haplogroups within Europe to trace them directly to Celtic nations. So I'm pretty sure that haplogroups within Africa you can trace directly to Celtic nations, or not African nations. I apologize. Uh, so I'm pretty sure that you can do the same. Um, my aunt, so DNA, the way that DNA plays is that so my mother has two exes, and one of those exes she got from her mother, and one of those exes she got from her father. Her father's mother gave him an ex. The ex that she gave him is a combination of the two exes that she has, and that combination is not set. Okay. So that combination changes with each child that you have. And so when you're passing along that DNA, you can absolutely pass like the haplogroup genetic from one grandmother to child A, but not pass the haplogroup from one grandmother to child B, right? So my mother's DNA has not been done, but my DNA, and then I've had both my aunt and my great aunt, my maternal aunt and my maternal great aunt. I have both of their DNAs that I get to play with, and for my maternal aunt, she has Sudanese DNA and Sudanese haplogroups, but I don't actually have, like, within the X structure of haplogroups within my DNA have that. So I can trace the grandmother that I know of to the Sudan because and they're full siblings, right? So I can trace the DNA that I know of my grandmother. Like I knew of my grandmother. I have pictures of my grandmothers that you can look at and see. I posted one, like there's a video on there, and you can look at that grandmother and you can tell that she is definitely passing. But uh, so I have that family knowledge, but to trace that root, I had to actually go through my aunt's DNA instead of my DNA to get those haplogroups. And so I haven't actually played deep enough with her DNA to trace it back to specific regions because I also already know that it goes back to the Sudan, right? And so that's how like haplogroups can be, but it's also helpful to have your full siblings haplogroups too, because really your full siblings haplogroups are the only way to get the fullest understanding. I'm not E1B1. I don't know what E1B1 is. Do you know where the word shaman comes from that you're using? It's not a Turtle Island indigenous term. It's not something that really applies to Turtle Island indigenous animism. The Russians appropriated it from the Tungan people who use it, Siberian group of people actually, who use it to speak about their animistic priests, right? And it's documented that they appropriated it from these people in 1680 83. Okay. So the word shaman is actually Russian appropriation of an Asiatic term. Just so you know that you're using it appropriately. You're Asiatic? I find it funny that they appropriated it from one group of people, right? They stole it from one group of people and appropriated it and then applied it to a group of people on a completely different space. Like, I'm like, "Oh, that's Russia for you." You have said a couple of things about people here in Turtle Island not being Turtle Island indigenous people, right? So I have assumed that from some of the things that you've stated. Yes, I have assumed that. Though, I mean, I am correct on the etymology of the word shaman. So you're saying the Sangoma people use the word shaman? The Sangoma people of Africa, of South Africa? I mean, okay, so I should not be expected to know every nation's name. Um, I don't even think I know probably know a couple hundred nations' names within the Turtle Islands, and probably a few within Africa, but not a whole lot. So, national, who are the Sangomas? Where are the Sangomas from? Because the only Sangomas that I know of are within the Zulu nation. That's awesome, Luna. She's a cool, frigging amazing human being. Olga of Kiev actually traveled all over Eurasia and she was the start of the Varangian Guard. She's why the Varangian Guard started. She's frigging amazing. So you said I don't know what it is, but I've told you what I do know of it, and I'm asking you to identify what nation of people it is if it's not the Zulu nation or a group within the Zulu nation. Oh my, You said balloon. I was like, I'm looking at my background screen. I know my partner brought that home for me the other morning. It's a Pretty Little Mermaid. I had roses that they brought home too, but the cats keep getting into them, so I had to take them out of here. Yeah, she was so cool. Hi, Kitty. I'm gonna switch out my picture here, so it might pause me. That's not the one I wanted. There it is. There it is. Yeah, I have to put them all somewhere safe. Like when the kids moved out, I converted their closet, their bedroom into a walk-in closet, and so like we have this walk-in closet that I put them in right now so that they can stay safe until they dry, and then I'm going to put them up somewhere. So I'm assuming you had to go and Google what Sangoma was since you haven't answered. They'll tell you that Google says that the Sangoma is actually a healer within the Zulu Nation. It's actually the word for healer for the Zulu Nation is what Google states. So, oh, are you okay, baby? Did I get you? I'm so sorry. You okay? I didn't mean to get you. I was trying to adjust as the me. I didn't mean to get the you. I apologize. You okay, baby? Yeah, right. Like he's no longer here. I think that we have stuttered his thought process. But that's what we're here for today. Let's stutter some thought processes. Good morning, Wicked. Oh, don't worry. Yeah, stuttering some thought processes today. I think I think that might just be the way to go is to start asking them their history here and how they know it, right? How do we start asking, how do you know your history? Like we know ours. Like who told you your history? Who taught you your history? How far back? What are your origin stories? What do your origin stories state about this space? Because when you're getting your stuff from people's, from white people's desire to justify their shit again, it doesn't work as well. That wordage looks Lakota or Nakota, Luna, but I could be completely wrong. Oh, okay. Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. It's like the Wea looked a lot like a couple of the Lakota words, and I was like, I'm not sure I know that one. That's beautiful. I had somebody trying to argue with me today on, I think, one of Brown Girl's videos that that her grandmother had told her stories of the mounds, but her grandmother was a black woman who had been captured and enslaved here. That she had some grandmothers who had come over on the Middle Passage, but some grandmothers who were black who had been enslaved here and captured here, and they were the indigenous people. She's like, and I bet your grandmother didn't tell you stories about the mounds. And I'm like, actually, my grandmother did. Like, my grandmother told me stories about all that shit, right? Like, she was like, there are people that have been there, and they weren't our stories and they weren't ones that I heard for, like I didn't hear origin stories about him from her, but I did absolutely hear like, the stories of the people that have been there, and stories of things that had happened in those areas a little bit. Like, yeah, actually, not. But she certainly didn't mention that that was the people that were there. She mentioned somebody else. Oh, sorry, my body is just hating me this week. Um, so DNA supports that Turtle Island indigenous people get here after 50,000 years ago, as the last common ancestor of everybody outside of Africa is 50,000 years ago through DNA. And then there are about 10,000 years living among or interacting with the Denisovians on their way over. Currently, they're looking at a southern boat route. There's a couple articles that are out about a southern boat route, taking a route through the Pacific Islands. During the last ice age, if you look, the Pacific Islands actually looks like there's some continents that would have been there that are rather large during the last ice age. And so it's quite possible, that it wasn't even that bad of a boat hop over, right? And so they're currently looking at a southern boat route because of the Denisovian DNA. So Denisovian DNA currently today is found in people who are in Southeast Asia, and in the islands of the South Pacific and in Australia and Australasia. And so within this space, it they're like, well, did they come over and then they go up, right? Like that just doesn't make sense, especially since there's nothing ice free there, right? Like the ice free corridor is 18 to 15,000 years ago, right? And so since there was nothing there to actually make it through during that, we're it makes so much more sense than Bering Strait. And it absolutely like I don't think that it will negate completely the fact that there is travel through the Bering Strait. Um, some of the backward migration, because they are seeing that there is backward migration from the Turtle Islands to Siberia. And we see this because like X1 mitochondrial DNA is here, but X2 mitochondrial DNA is in Siberia. Um, we number them as they descend down, basically. So we do see some backwards migration. We also, I personally think the backwards migration is probably because it's all among the Arctic groups, right? Later migrations are Arctic, and there is backward migration among Arctic groups in Europe, right? The Siberian people are all along the Arctic up in there, right? So personally, I think that if you got a bunch of people living in the Arctic that know how to utilize the Arctic, they're doing this back and forth and this mix and this flow across the Arctic. It makes total sense to me that there's a lot of boat, um, sledding, dogs, different things that we know have happened in the Arctic regions by different Arctic groups for thousands of years, right? So I do believe in the later spaces that we're getting some of that backwards migration there, and some later migration over there. We do see evidence of like a migration about 8,000 years ago as well. So we do see evidence of a couple of different migrations over before Europe really gets that disconnect, right? Before Eurasia starts that disconnect. But we do see that it looks like the initial migration over that is the foundation that all these other groups come into and meld into later on, um, is coming over along a southern boat route. at the end of the last ice age when there is more ability of a southern boat route. And we're seeing that through DNA because we have Neanderthal, Denisovian, and then, of course, we have that ghost species within us here in Turtle Island. And we're seeing again in pre contact DNA, right? So, and these are all almost all pre contact finds in South America. Southern Turtle Island, just because of the fact that we're not seeing a lot of sorry, and I know what I'm trying to say, and it's not even that, it's just not holding. Many of the finds here in the US and in Canada were repatriated before DNA. Ancient DNA was being able to be done. We do have some that have ancient DNA, but because we don't have a lot of finds here in North America, North Turtle Island, are in Turtle Island, we're not seeing that we have the DNA for them because they've been repatriated, which is positive. And with what has happened with DNA here and what has happened with science and what has happened with medicine here in United States and Canada, completely, understandable why we do not have a lot of Turtle Island Indigenous DNA, period, from groups within these spaces. There's a lot of avoidance for a very good reason, right? For safety reasons, for resilient reasons. Um, so most of the DNA that we're seeing is DNA that we're seeing in South America, Southern, and then no, because they said that that's actually North America. I still can't pronounce right, and I can't even pull it up in my head enough. But with that, it does show though that migration coming from the South Pacific, coming over via boats. And if you talk to, so there are so many different, or well, not so many different. There is about what I have heard of, roughly 4 different origin stories in Turtle Island in North America. Um, but some of them translate down to Mesoamerica. And one that's always translated down, yeah, that translates it down, or that translates down into Mesoamerica, is a boat people thought process, like coming over on boats, like arriving on boats, or arriving here via crossing water, right? Like being on the water and arriving here. And there's others. I mean, there's Sky Woman, right? The falling, which also creates the royal tree and also involves that water, like into a world that is nothing but water, right? There's also another Sky People story that I know of. But those are just the ones I know of, and I don't know everybody's creation stories. I haven't tried to. But so yeah, and Sea People. There's a couple of different stories, but one prevalent one is boats coming across sea, right? That's awesome. Is that like a formed from Luna? Um, but because so many of the West Coast, it seems to me, uh legends or creation stories actually have that water landing, right? Like that being in the water, the boats have always made more of a sense to me than anything else. Oh, that's awesome. That's like underground. That really makes sense with the mounds too, right? Like that really makes the mounds actually make a lot of sense because then it's almost that reformation of that, right? That's beautiful. Well, and if you think about it, that one has a lot of like evolution scientific backing, right? Right? Like so if we're just another group of the animals, and we're just kind of coming out And it is the starting to live in that shelter environment that we started to live in that shelter environment from that kind of like I think helps create our movement forward into who we are today, right? So that actually kind of like I can scientific that one, like I can see the truth that or not the truth, because all creation stories have truth, but the I can see the facts, right? I can see the things that you can sit there and go, oh yeah, see, here's the evidence for that, and here's the evidence for that within that. That's a beautiful one. I hadn't heard that. Um, I think though, when you look at so many of the different stories that a boat route is really supported, right? And we should absolutely be looking to Indigenous peoples for their own creation stories, right? Um, I firmly still believe that we are all one species, and that we are, and that came out with a bit of a laugh only because of the fact that I find the idea that we are different species to be very doubling down on race, right? Like, oh, we just got rid of race, so now let's be different species instead, right? Like, let's give another reason to kill people. Let's give another reason to dehumanize people because you're not as human as I'm a human. If you were not as human as I'm human because of different race, then you're definitely not as human as I human if we have different species, right? So, like for me, that's just really, ugh. But I think that when we look at the different creation stories along in different spaces, we can absolutely see where there's a science behind them as well, right? Um, I think that our ideas that we're all different groups of beings, you know, Yahweh belonged to a pantheon of gods, and Yahweh had a wife, and Yahweh chose a specific group of people to be his people. And Yahweh said, "You are my special and my chosen to the Judaic people." I think that every group has a story in which they are the original people, right? Um, that they are the original choice, or the original, if it's a deity involvement or something like that. Everybody has this, but even in all of them, there's this understanding that they're unique among others. There's never this idea that they're, even in Adam and Eve, they had other beings around them, right? There's never this idea that there's only them. There's never, that I have seen, an idea that even in the ones that I hear that state we're a special and unique created being, right? We were created here and you were created there. Um, Even in that, there's still other beings around at this time, right? There's still other creation, right? It is not only. And we can absolutely evolve out of. So, at 300,000 years ago, when we start, our brains are shaped like this, right? When we start, we see that Naladi's brain is shaped like our brain is now, which is like this. And Naladi has the ability to transport fire. Naladi has the ability to bury their dead. They actually do ritualistic stuff with their dead, and they're at 330,000 to 230,000 years old, right? Um, and these actions are happening then. Human beings, as we are today, Homo sapiens, are created in the middle of that, like almost smack dab in the middle of that, right? And in this evolution in this time period, we're not as advanced as Naladi is. Naladi is very advanced. We are the dumb ones at this time frame, right? We are the non-special group of beings in this time frame, right? It takes us, they believe, from about 300,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago to get our brain shape from this being the front, your sloped up forehead, this being where your spine is, and this being the back of your skull sticking out, to this shape. This shape is what we believe gives us the different uh abilities that we have, like I'm sorry, somebody's messaging me on Discord. Has the different abilities that we have, the advanced thinking that we have, right? This comes from what we call a globular brain in lobes. And because our brain is like that, it gives us these neurons and this firing. This took us a while to develop. And we know that this took us a while to develop because the things that are associated with this brain come before we see the finalization of this brain shape. So this takes us, we start this. If you are in here and messaging me on Discord, can you wait for a little bit, please? Um, and we start this about 60 to 70,000 years ago within the Neanderthals is where we see our first evidence of it, right? And so it is this movement forward that gives us to where we're at today. And if we're at this space today and we started in that space then and we get to different spaces 30,000 years ago, we're in a lot of different spaces, right? This is at the time that our origin stories are starting, right? Because this, well, 60, 70,000 years ago, because this is at the time when we're starting to see an out of ourselves, an esoteric, a, uh, this is where that God center of our brain starts developing, right? Because we have that center of our brain that believes in something outside of ourselves, right? And it's where that starts to develop. And so, because of that, this is where our creation stories are starting to come out. So, by this point, we're in different spaces. So, if Africa still has a good portion of people in Africa, but the people who eventually move out of Africa are in the Levant area and in North Africa, because it's all within that North Africa, Levant up into, I think it's Turkey, but I'm geographically challenged. So it's all within that area that we see people living outside of Africa and in North Africa, and it's that group of people who become everybody else coming outside of Africa afterwards, right? Now they're going back in and they're coming back out. There's always this genetic mix and flow that is constantly happening within humanity, right? And because of that, what we're seeing is that by the time, so again, we have certain things that are global in creation stories. The world tree is everywhere. I have yet to hear a people that do not have a tree, a world tree within their stories. The world tree takes different shapes in different places, right? Like not as well, the tree takes different shapes in different spaces, but the meaning behind the tree takes shape differently in different spaces too, right? Sometimes that world tree connects all the different worlds. Sometimes we all live along the world tree. There's, different ways that this takes place. But it's everywhere, which means that it's one of those things that we had before we separated, right? Before we get out from that thought mixing, vibrant bowl of forward movement within our development as a species. But after that, everything else that's coming along, and it makes sense because, like, that's nature, right? Think about it. Like, if our initial thought process is something outside of ourselves is represented in a very physical part of nature that provides so much for us, doesn't that make so much sense for us as a species? So when we're moving out of that, yeah, I don't like Jungian thought process though. Like, I believe in a collective energy and a collective consciousness. But I'm not sure I like Jung's thought processes in most things. So I'm not sure if I would frame it that way, but that just because I Jungian thought process really is Western based, and I really have issues within the Western base of it. Anyways, but I can see that correlation. Uh, when we're seeing that movement out, right, and the way that all these groups are coming out and they're indigenating in their space, right? They're settling into their space. They're developing language. They're developing stories. They're developing their history within their space. And as they're doing this, they're developing their stories within this space. And their creation stories are therefore talking about them being created within this space. It doesn't mean that they're a separate species, right? It means that they are being created in this biome, and because this biome itself is us, right? If I belong to the biome and the biome belongs to me, right? If we are this unique interlaced mesh web of life, right? Then I am reborn within that space too, right? So creating within that space, coming out within that space, being within that space and creating our idea of identity within this space means that our creation stories are going to be individualistic to some extent, because there are some threads that kind of just flow, right? Are going to be individualistic, and they're going to be unique about us being created in that space. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we didn't originally come out of Africa, right? Absolutely, Jedi. And like I said, I mean, I can see that correlation. That's cool. I just, from my thought process, Jungian thought process just doesn't work very well. But even like talking to somebody the other day, because we had somebody who come in here who was Quay, because I have been saying a name that is associated with the Quay people that is not appropriate because it's a colonizer term and it's a slur. When we were talking about the fact that the Quay people of Africa are the original population, they are the population with all the genetics. They are the population that has all the genetic diversity of our people, and not of our people, of Homo sapiens. All the genetic diversity of Homo sapiens is within the Quay people. Um, and they are one of the populations that does not have Neanderthal DNA, but they do have DNA from ghost species. And I'm not sure if the three other ghost species is between those two populations, or both of those species each have all three of those species. So I can't be specific about that. But within that, um, their origin stories state that other people were created in other spaces and they're created unique. So the science doesn't match with their origin stories. And yet, to me, I think that the science matches with their origin stories as well, because if the origin stories are about us identifying us coming into the origin, this coming into the understanding of ourselves as having an identity, right? Is when our origins start, right? When we are created. Our identity is created and we are created, right? And so when we look at that, we can see that there's already our species everywhere, our identities, our indigeneity, our biome intermix is being created in a way that is dependent on an identity, right? Because before that, we don't have an identity outside of just being another animal within the species, within the biome, right? So we don't necessarily need that identity, right? But when we start that identity, our creation story comes into being for each group, right? Um, Now, I personally think that this goes back 100,000 years. I think that it takes a long time for the adaptation of the brain to happen. And I think that we can start to see evidence going back that far, because we start to see evidence, I believe, of identifying. Um, we like to say that cave art and burial is really the start, and I do agree with that. But we also start to see beadwork. I think our oldest beads are like 80,000 years ago in Africa, but I'd have to take a look. And they're in like South Africa on the southern tip, but I'd have to take a look. And so, like, I do believe that we start to see those identifying factors and that identifying thought process earlier, right? And so that would mean that we're having some creation stories that go back even deeper, because we're starting to see that those are the spaces maybe where the first thoughts are coming out of, right? Or those are the spaces where there were people at the time, because there weren't people in other spaces at the time, right? And so we do see that some of these spaces have that ability. Uh, but we really must put weight on people's creation stories. And not only must we put weight on people's creation stories, with understanding that science really proves most creation stories correct. If you actually read the creation story and don't make it, so even creation stories written about omnipotent deities have truth within them if you read the creation story itself and don't make it about some magic, right? Um, but I also believe magic is energy and that magic is real. So I kind of got to go, um, but if you can actually see the magic, the science in magic and the magic in science, right? Then you can see the magic within creation stories and the scientific truth within creation stories. Um, when we're coming to things like dealing with who was in space or, taking, uh, appropriating people's histories, right? Um, Well, I think it goes further than that because, like, somebody has said the other day, you don't do this when the white people are claiming that they're indigenous. And it's like, but white people aren't claiming that we're not indigenous and they are, in fact, the indigenous ones, right? So there's a difference between trying to replace a people and trying to claim part of a people, right? Not that we don't give people who try and claim part, who are not plenty of shit, right? But there's a huge difference between trying to replace and say that you don't exist, it's me instead, and in saying, oh, I belong, right? I belong, I don't, but I belong, I don't. So I think that when we're looking at that, we have to understand that the best proof we have is the proof we have, right? We are the best proof we have isn't what somebody else documented, but what our grandmothers told us. The creation stories, the origin stories. What is your creation story? My origin story says that, you know, um, Sky Woman fell and spread the mud across turtle's shell or a tortoise's shell. And this is why my land looks like this, right? This is why North America looks like a turtle. This is my creation story. Um, what does your creation story say? Um, and then we can always direct people like, you know, the quiet creation story says this, or the oil creation story says this, or this group of people has this creation story. Do you think that maybe that might ring because you don't have one and I do, right? This is obviously, yeah, I have the creation story of this land, right? um and the histories, because people like to think that Turtle Island, people like to think that Europeans got to Turtle Island in 1492 and by 1500 it was white, right? That's awesome, Amara. I mean, I think North America itself looks like a turtle when I look at it. I think depending on the type of turtle, yes, I would say, right? But some turtles, I think, well, some turtles have like a tail that has like a bulb at the end of it, and so that would make sense. Trying to picture, anyways, but um, when we are looking at that, and when we're working through that, there are other stories out there, and pointing that out, and then pointing different spaces. Here's this a space to go. Yes, that one though only shows the drawing around North America, all the way down into Mesoamerica, like to the break at Mexico with South America, right? That's the drawing that shows the turtle around. I think I actually have. Hold on a second, if I can. This will pause me. This one, you mean? Yeah. Well, and this one only goes down to Mesoamerica, if you'll note. Like, okay, so the leg over here on the right is Florida, and the leg on the left is California, and the leg up north is Alaska, and then Greenland is the face. And then we can't see really the leg to the upper leg to the right, which is there's like peninsulas over there. That upper portion before it goes in, that's that leg to the right. But I don't think it go. I don't think it like encompasses in the turtle itself. I don't think it encompasses South America. I do believe that many legends, when they talk about it, they are talking about the globe as a whole, and therefore it would have South America perceived within that global whole. Uh, I just, from my understanding, know that many people perceive it as just being the northern continent, but I'm not saying that there aren't people out there that perceive it to be both. Or at least I'm not trying to. If it sounds like that is what I'm saying, that's not what I'm trying to.
Let me change me back. Let me change me back. It will pause me for a second.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. I totally forgot I had that picture in there, and it's a good thing to have and to be able to show. So the DNA absolutely shows that it's most likely a southern boat route, and most likely coming in from South America. And I've always kind of laughed at this. So the oldest DNA that they had here in Turtle Island, they had one in North America. I think it's like at St. Joseph's Island, like it's right up near Alaska, like it's far up north. And then they had one in Brazil, and they were like both 15,000 years old, right? And so I'm in geneticist classes in archaeology, getting my degree and looking at genetics from ancient DNA, right? And they're talking about the genetic flows and the pathways, and they don't address the X mitochondrial DNA at all, which really like, I'm like, hey, what about that? What about that? What about that? I want more. Anyways, but um, they're like, so 15,000 years ago is the earliest that people got here. And we're seeing people at 15,000 years ago with this DNA. And this traces back to 15,000 years ago in Alaska. And this one here in Brazil traces back to 15,000 years. And I'm like, shit, you think we're Speedy Gonzalez, don't you? Like, you literally think that we made it less than a generation from Alaska to Brazil. That doesn't make sense to me. Did we fly? Did we have cars? Did we float? Like, how did we, in less than a generation, make it from Alaska to Brazil in an original population, like a singular group of like 30, 40 people, right? How do you think that we did that in less than a generation? That just doesn't make sense to me. Like, so much about Western thought just in academia like slips knowledge, like slips sense. Like, where's the logic within that? What do you mean, right? Like, how did you logically compute that to compute out factually? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. um but when they're looking at these new DNA things going over, and as it's progressing, they're absolutely seeing that there's a lot earlier DNA, more recent, and they're absolutely seeing that Denisovian DNA. And because of the way they're seeing the Denisovian DNA and the amount, they believe that we were living with the Denisovians for about 10,000 years before we made it over here, which means that they believe that we went along the lower half of Europe or Eurasia to get over here. I had a recent thing that I came across, and I want to pull it up because It's not the right one. It's not the right one. That's why. Yeah. Well, and there are okay, so they found DNA come back from a planet like 5 years ago, like on some stone that had come back from a planet too. Maybe it's the same one. Maybe it's the same one, but they had found the DNA in in a stone from another planet. So I'm going to give you a couple of different things actually. One of them has nothing to do with well, both of them have very little to do. Okay. So they just found an obsidian hand making workshop from 1.2 million hand axe making workshop from 1.2 million years ago in Ethiopia. That's awesome, Dish. That's awesome. That's awesome. I think that there's absolutely life out there. I just think it's not contacting us because we're too evil right now. Like not us as a species, but like the way that we're living right now doesn't. I think we'd kill anything that came out and try to talk to us right now. So they found an obsidian hand axe making workshop from 1.2 million years ago in the Awash Valley in Ethiopia. So this is they did not believe before this that obsidian is something that was used a whole lot by oh is that oh my god, that would be awesome. They did not believe before this that obsidian was really worked for hand axes by erectus a whole heck of a lot, but this is some actual fine worked obsidian, and is basically showing like I'm going to actually show you the picture of this. Look at this. It's like this huge, like stacked obsidian pieces that are like half worked. And they've just like layered up in the valley, like almost like they were tossing pieces aside. Let me turn that around before I. Almost like they were tossing pieces aside. Yeah, right? Hold on just a second, YouTube. Let me get this up for you. Let me throw you. I am so sorry, YouTube. I really did not mean to throw you like that. Here is the obsidian hand axe. As you can see, like this is how far it's going up into the thing. And you can see this like shelf here. And then you can see like the markings. Oh, come on. What did I just do? I'm so great at technology. I swear to God. There we go. You can see like the markings where they are actually napping within the stone here. So this is really cool because this is a find that shows us like this gathering and making these much earlier than we thought we were doing this. We did know that they were making hand axes, but at this time period, but it's that gathering and doing it out of obsidian. And this one is really cool to me. Polygamous birds are shown to have fewer harmful mutations. Might polygamy be a positive? Anyways. But those are a couple of interesting new finds that I saw. I'll go ahead and make sure that they're up on the website within the next couple of days. I just found them like the day before yesterday, and I still have to get everything transferred over, or what I'm transferring over. But We've got a couple of cool little things. Um, that's the This is what I'm looking for. That's England. Okay, it's not here. That's the other one. Mm-mm. Hey, we were talking about cannibalism earlier. Prehistoric Britain cannibalism was practical and ritualistic by Scientific American. Um, Smithsonian. Ancient DNA charts Native Americans' journey to Asia thousands of years ago. Analysis of 10 Eurasian individuals up to 7,500 years old gives a new picture of movement across continents. Whether by walking a land bridge or traveling by boats, hunter gatherers ventured from eastern Eurasia some 20 to 30,000 years ago to become the first Americans. I'd say 30 to 40,000 years ago because our oldest finds are 33,000 years old. But the intercontinental journey wasn't a one-way trip. Several times in history, genetic studies show Native Americans returned across the Bering Strait to Eurasia long before Europeans began arriving in distant parts of the Americas. Now, new genetic research is mapping out those ancient migrations back and forth across the Bering Strait and elsewhere across Eurasia during key periods of human prehistory. Scientists have recently recovered ancient DNA from the well-preserved bones and teeth of 10 Eastern Eurasian individuals from 75,000 years ago to 500 years ago. 7,500 years ago to 500 years ago, and they published their findings on Thursday in Current Biology. This new evidence helps show that from the coasts of America and Japan to the Siberian interior, some of our deep ancestors' populations may have been more mobile and intermixed than anyone would have imagined. Cosmo Post, an archaeogeneticist expert at the University of Tübingen in Germany, and colleagues described the genomes of 10 different individuals who lived in 3 key regions: Siberia's Altoy Mountains, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and other parts of the Russian Far East. Environmental conditions, cold climates at high latitudes, allowed for optimal preservation of DNA that was hundreds to thousands of years old. In these environments, you can find individuals with 70 to 80% of human DNA in their bones, comparable to what you get if you extract saliva from you or me. You can actually generate a genome of the same quality as a modern genome. It's amazing stuff. The analysis of the DNA from those 10 individuals proves several key revelations about ancient migrations. First, the broad movements of ancient humans and cultures across Eurasia are evidenced by the discovery of an entirely new population that lived in Siberia's Altoy Mountains. That culture's descendants, the authors show, were part of lineages that later helped populate both Europe and the Americas. Secondly, individuals of Japan's Yomon culture, isolated in the archipelago for thousands of years, migrated back to the Asian mainland from which their ancestors came. And finally, Native Americans migrated back into Asia several times over a span of thousands of years. The remains of some of the study's oldest individuals, dated to some 7,500 years before present, are part of the previously unknown population of hunter-gatherers who lived in Altoy Mountains. Today, this crossroads is a kind of Eurasian four corners where Russia, Mongolia, China, and Kazakhstan border one another. Back in the early Holocene, at least 10,000 years ago, the Altoy population lived in a region that was slowly warming. Post's analysis showed that this group was a genetic mixture of 2 distinct groups who lived in different parts of Siberia during the last ice age, the Paleo-Siberians and the ancient North Eurasians. The Paleo-Siberian population contributed to the first wave of humans to cross into the Americas. That's no longer something we're seeing as true. We're really seeing that it looks like they're coming across that southern region with some of the other findings. The Smithsonian isn't bringing in the finding about the Denisovian DNA into this article. just so that you understand that dynamic. A lot of times, it's really hard to see where one article is stating one thing where you have a different article that's stating a wholly different thing. And you're like, well, which one do I go with? Right. So, what you have to do is you kind of got to pull some things, right? Like now we know, and we've talked about there is some back and forth, like there's definitely later migrations over, and so maybe sure some of them but not the first, because that's talking 10,000 years ago. We know 33,000 years ago. We also know that there is that lower pathway migration because of the Denisovian DNA, and we also know that that's the earlier and that's the earliest DNA that we're seeing. um, the Paleo-Siberian population contributed the first waves of humans to cross into Americas, and many Native Americans today can trace parts of their ancestry to this group. Again, this is 10,000 years ago. 3 paragraphs before, they state that the first waves are coming in at 20 to 30,000 years ago, right? So even within their article, they're kind of debunking their timeline just a little bit, right? Just so like you see this within this. The ancient North Eurasian lineage first appears in a 2400-year Malta individual from the Lake Baikal region, and over time made significant genetic contributions to nearly all European populations and to later North American migrations as well. Now, this one, they are putting it as later North American migrations, which more possible. The Altai Mountains are the same region where the 2000 discovery of a fragmented finger bone turned out after DNA analysis to identify an entirely new species of close human relatives, the Denisovians. And so this is where we're seeing some Denisovians. So there is the possibility of living there. But again, we are seeing that it's that Siberia being so far north, and what we're seeing with lineage with I'll take a look at it. But this is kind of contradicting that other stuff that's talking about that lower. The Altai Mountains in Siberia being that farther north, right? Their lineage was after DNA analysis identify an entirely new species of close human relatives, the Denisovians. Their lineage, which exists from about 400,000 to about 30,000 years ago, 13,000 years ago is our current knowledge, has turned out to be a rather complicated one. In 2018, scientists learned that a 13-year-old girl found in a mountain cave, that's Denisovian cave. So this is the range where Denisovian cave is. But we don't see Denisovian DNA in modern populations in that area. We see Denisovian DNA in modern populations in Southeast Asia, not in Siberia. Showing not only different species path, but interbreed. The 6,500-year-old individual's genetic profile is different from his Altai region contemporaries and more akin to populations from Russia's Far East. And that one has burial goods with it. I'm looking for the one that's talking about actually having it come back, like seeing that backwards movement. Okay. Pasha and his colleagues compare the genomes of 3 500-year-old individuals in the Kamchatka Peninsula with people living there today. The 500-year-old individuals have significant amounts of Native American ancestry, but those living in the same peninsula today have twice as much. These events represent only half the story. Growing genetic and archaeological evidence reveals that some populations made a round-trip journey. That result means that some Native Americans have returned to Eurasia before 500 years ago, probably about 5,000 years ago, according to estimates of when genetic lineages converged with the ancient specimens. They also revealed that Native American peoples migrated across the Bering Strait more recently. These are those later migrations that we've talked about. Scientists can't definitely say where those migrations originated. And these are all testing up in the Aleut, Athabascan, and Bering Sea lineages. So they're talking about 6,000 years ago using watercraft, but we have evidence that Japan and Asia is using watercraft at 21,000 years ago, right? I am on YouTube also. So we have evidence going back that far. We have evidence going back that far of sailing in Japan and Asia. And so if we have evidence going back that far of sailing in those spaces, then we're going to see that water movement is going to go back further. We also know that water movement is going back further because we see it within Erectus, right? So I have to go. I'm sorry, my body is giving out. I will try and make time for an evening live this weekend so that I can get in for everybody for the weekend. Maybe tomorrow night. I don't think we're going out tomorrow night or doing anything this weekend. So I'll try and do that. But if not, I'll be back Sunday night. It's chronic. It's just days, right? Some days are days and some days are not days. Some days work and some days don't. Um, I will be back though. And I know you guys, and thank you so much for sitting and listening to my spiels. Have a great day. And if you see anything interesting or have anything we need to talk about, go ahead and let me know and I will bring it in and see what we can do to kind of create a better space. I'll talk to you guys talk to you guys later. My words aren't even working at this point. And if you're here on YouTube still, though, does not look like it, I will see you later too. Oh.